this through.
Let's suppose that political leaders remain dilatory or resistant. What happens?
If they cannot address this in a credible way, I believe within perhaps 2 to 3 weeks we will have a meltdown in sovereign debt, which will produce a meltdown across the European banking system. We're not just talking about a relatively small Belgian bank. We're talking about the largest banks in the world, the largest banks in Germany, the largest banks in France. That will spread. It will spread to the United Kingdom, in part through sovereign debt problems in Ireland. It will spread everywhere because the global financial system is so interconnected. They are each all those banks are counterparties to every significant bank in the United States and in Britain and in Japan and around the world. This would be a crisis that would be, in my view, more serious than the crisis in 2008.
Lord, is he exaggerating, Lord Minus?
I wish I could give a more cheerful complexion, but we're on the verge of a perfect storm. A number of European countries cannot raise money. Banks are therefore increasingly worried about the default. Therefore, people won't lend money to banks, and therefore banks won't lend money to business. So something has to be done, and has to be done substantially across the whole of Europe. If you do it individually, country by country, you should simply shift the focus from one country or one bank to another. That's why in October 2008 we obliged all the major UK banks to increase their capitalisation.
We're often accused, journalists, of being apocalyptic, but this is an apocalypse, isn't it? I mean, what happened to the spirit of the G20?
Well, I think on a more positive note, you can still see a way around this. I mean, you can still see a way of taking concerted action which would now... the banks have got short-term funding, so they can get short-term funding from the European Central Bank, so there's not an immediate liquidity crisis. If we can get a situation where the banks are recapitalised, where the Greek situation is sorted out, and the markets can therefore be convinced that Spain and Italy, which are really the big ones, will get through this, even with some trouble, and we can push things out a couple of years until that happens, then I think it can still be averted.
Are we talking about a crisis here that affects, apart from the taxpayer having to bail out a bank if action is taken, if the banks go under, does it affect ordinary people?
Well, it will have an effect on economic activity. It's worthwhile saying here, Jeremy, that the UK banks are pretty strongly capitalised. This is not a problem for UK and Scandinavian banks.
You've already heard Dr. Shapiro say it will affect UK banks.
It will affect the UK economy. It will affect the UK economy, which is why we have an interest in the outcome. But the UK banks, in relative terms, are very well capitalised compared with most European banks.
Dr. Shapiro, go on.
Well, what we don't know, we do know, for example, in the United States, our banks have relatively little exposure to European sovereign debt. They've been getting rid of those holdings for a year. However, no one knows the state of credit default swaps held by these institutions against sovereign debt and against European banks. Nor do we know the state of credit default swaps held by British banks. Nor are we certain of how serious the exposure of British banks is to Ireland's sovereign debt problems.
Right. What needs to happen right now, Lord Minus?
Very significant agreement across Europe to recapitalise the banks. This problem can be solved, Jeremy. It's within the wit of man to do it, but it requires the political will of Europe's leaders to agree a programme as soon as possible.
And thus far we haven't seen it, have we?
No, I mean, they're talking in more urgent terms about the plan for the plan, but we haven't got the plan yet, and we need to get that now.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
We really need two things. We need not only to recapitalize the banks, even more crucially, we have to come up with a credible plan to preserve the stability of the sovereign debt of Italy and Spain.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed.